Well, this week's forum was, I would say, as sophisticated as any case conference I've been part of. Um, it was quite remarkable, based on a comprehensive and eloquent literature review, um, and a very good um, case vignette, which, as Larissa pointed out, did a really good job of um, providing crumbs to lead toward a diagnosis. With that as a foundation, you all, as a group, extended and even further deepened the conversation and made very useful additions and asked questions that stimulated further conversation. So I would say that you are maximizing this distance learning platform, and fully engaging in a way that's to everyone's benefit. Um, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the historical context of ideas about etiology of schizophrenia. As recently as the early 90s, um, the prevailing explanation for etiology was the schizophrenic family, particularly the schizophrenic mother. And the idea was that this was a mother who would give mixed signals to the infant. For example, holding the infant, but holding the infant in a rigid way. Um, that mother combined with a distant, weak father. Now, you may think this sounds like the most absurd uh, thing imaginable, but that was actually what uh, scholars thought. And I remember being instructed to teach that when I was a TA at the University of Chicago in the early 90s. So there you go. It's just yet another exciting episode of mommy blaming. So you can imagine the stress and duress that parents, particularly mothers, um, would be under when they go to meet with a physician or a family therapist who would be operating under the assumption that they were the problem. You can imagine that families already have a huge amount of stress uh, and often guilt related to major mental illness in a child. It's like losing a child in a certain way, certainly losing your dreams for that child. And it's a huge adverse life event for parents and families that requires a major transition. And if you combine that with professionals who are telling you that it's your fault, and with them telling you also the prevailing idea that schizophrenia was untreatable and lifelong, you can imagine how difficult that would be. It was also assumed that families were dysfunctional in the sense that they created a tremendous amount of stress, and that's family stress is what brought on symptoms of schizophrenia in the children. There was also a theory that actually my advisor, who's a very famous family therapist, uh, she was um, involved with, which was that uh, when a child died, the next child born would often be viewed, consciously or not, by parents as the, quote, replacement child, and that replacement child was more prone to develop schizophrenia. So, um, sad but true, this is what was going on um, at the University of Chicago and throughout the field in terms of understandings of the etiology of schizophrenia. Sounds really, really absurd when I think about it now, but I was there. It was very useful that you all brought up ideas related to culture, and I want to extend those a bit here. One thing is that it's very important to ascertain the family and the client's level of acculturation. So to what extent are they still embedded in their traditional culture and practices, or to what extent have they been colonized or, in this country, Americanized? Um, Similarly, related to spirituality, it's important not to assume anything related to spirituality. An individual or a family could be traditional in some ways, but view um, traditional spiritual practices as uh, the work of the devil, even, because many people who have been colonized have also been spiritually colonized and Christianized, so they have been taught to think that traditional spiritual practices, including traditional medicine, is a form of witchcraft, or at best something that is not to be taken seriously. And I've been in the room with two people who are um, very strongly connected to their own different tribal communities. And one was performing um, a, a traditional medicine on me, as a matter of fact, and the other was sitting in the same room but turning away because she didn't want any of that energy to affect her, because she was a born-again Christian. So just as it's important to understand how a person identifies culturally and in other terms of social identity, it's very important to understand how a person identifies spiritually. It's important also to note that the medical community historically has written off spiritual beliefs as delusional, or ideas of grandiosity, so or even ideas of reference. So that is another sad but true little historical bit there. In terms of the family, I agree that family psychoeducation is a really good idea. And just as important is emotional support for families. Again, many families are experiencing grief. It's also important to understand the meanings that families attach to the client's symptoms. Perhaps they think it's their own fault, or related to bad parenting, or it happened when there was a divorce, or back to cultural issues, maybe they think those symptoms are manifestations of evil spirits etc. It's very important to know those meanings when you're working with somebody. It's also important to identify and build a connection with the most powerful person in the family system and not to make any assumptions about who that person might be until you delve a little deeper and find out. It's not necessarily the loudest person. It, it could, for example, very well be the tiny little grandma dressed in black sitting in the corner saying nothing. So figure that out. Um, in terms of friends, through adolescence, it's necessary for them to have some direct instruction about how to build and maintain friendships. In the literature review, you referred to the inability to have insight into one's illness, and that the term for that is anosognosia, and you'll find actually in DSM it's listed as a symptom of many major mental disorders. Amador, who you referred to, is a psychiatrist and professor at Columbia University who has taught internationally and written about this issue. And he first got interested in it because his brother had schizophrenia, and he went through lots of very frustrating experiences trying to uh, win power struggles with his brother related to getting his brother to take his medication and admit that he had a problem. Um, in terms of motivational interviewing, etc., these kinds of interventions can be also very useful for medical compliance, but also as well as improving hygiene and participating in useful activities. Jessica, you make a wonderful, cogent point in terms of telemedicine and working with clients who have ideas of reference. That's something I hadn't thought of. That would be tricky. Someone mentioned that the case vignettes seem to be getting trickier as we progress, and I would submit that they're not getting trickier, but you all are getting more sophisticated, and that's very clear to me, and I appreciate that. So these are my enthusiastic and excited reflections on your excellent work.